Richard Hayes often believed buildings were easier to understand than people. Concrete followed calculations. Steel obeyed pressure. Every foundation revealed its strengths and weaknesses if examined carefully enough. Human hearts, however, hid cracks beneath polished smiles, and no blueprint could predict where they would eventually collapse. After nearly 23 years of marriage, Richard was convinced he had somehow mastered both architecture and love. At 51, Richard had earned a reputation as one of the city's most respected architects. Clients trusted his steady judgment, neighbors admired his quiet generosity, and colleagues often joked that nothing ever rattled him. Every weekday followed familiar routines, every evening ended at the same comfortable suburban home, where Victoria always greeted him with a warm smile that made long hours feel worthwhile. Their marriage had become something friends quietly envied. They celebrated anniversaries with small traditions instead of extravagant vacations. Every Sunday they shared breakfast on the back patio. Every December they decorated the house together while old holiday records played softly in the background. To outsiders, their life seemed almost impossibly peaceful. Only one silence lingered between them. They never had children. People occasionally asked whether they regretted it. Richard usually answered with an easy smile and changed the subject. Victoria would simply squeeze his hand beneath the table before steering the conversation elsewhere. Over time, family and friends stopped asking. Whatever sadness had once existed settled into an unspoken understanding neither wanted to disturb. With their 23rd anniversary only days away, Richard found himself reflecting more than usual. He remembered their first apartment with its leaking ceiling, the years they struggled financially, the promotions that slowly transformed hardship into comfort, and every obstacle they had overcome together. None of it would have meant anything without Victoria beside him. That week, however, something felt different. Victoria remained loving and attentive, yet moments of distraction crept into ordinary conversations. Richard noticed her checking her phone before quickly locking the screen whenever he entered the room. Once he heard her speaking quietly in the laundry room. As soon as he approached, the conversation ended. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. She smiled almost too quickly. "Just anniversary planning. I don't want you accidentally discovering your surprise." Richard laughed. "I promise not to investigate." "You'd better not," she replied, kissing his cheek. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Victoria had always loved planning thoughtful surprises, and Richard knew she took pride in making every anniversary memorable. He pushed away the faint uneasiness and returned to reviewing blueprints spread across his dining room table. Friday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather. Richard left work early carrying a bouquet of white lilies, Victoria's favorite flowers. He found her rearranging framed photographs in the living room. She looked startled when he entered, quickly placing one picture back onto the shelf before accepting the bouquet with grateful eyes. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "So are you." For a moment, the familiar warmth returned between them. Later that evening, while Victoria prepared dinner upstairs, the front doorbell interrupted the quiet house. Richard opened the door to find a postal courier holding a registered envelope. "Richard Hayes?" the courier asked. Richard signed the electronic pad and accepted the thick cream-colored envelope. There was no return address. No company logo. No handwritten note explaining who had sent it. He turned it over thoughtfully before placing it on his desk beside his reading glasses. "It can wait until after dinner," he murmured. Upstairs, Victoria called that the meal was ready. Richard smiled, leaving the unopened envelope behind, completely unaware that the ordinary-looking package waiting on his desk contained the first pieces of a truth capable of shattering 23 carefully built years forever. Dinner passed with familiar conversation, though Richard noticed Victoria barely touched her food. She smiled whenever he looked at her, yet the smile never reached her eyes. After clearing the dishes, she excused herself to take a shower while Richard wandered into his study. The cream-colored envelope still rested beside his reading glasses exactly where he had left it. Curiosity finally overcame patience. He slid a letter opener beneath the sealed flap and carefully unfolded the contents. Several yellowed documents spilled across the desk. At first, they seemed unrelated. There were copies of legal forms bearing unfamiliar names, faded medical records stamped more than 25 years earlier, and grainy photographs of a much younger person whose face seemed strangely familiar despite a different hairstyle and masculine clothing. A smaller envelope contained anonymous typed pages with no signature. Richard frowned. He picked up the first letter. Your wife has hidden the greatest lie of your life. Everything you need is enclosed. Ask her who she was before she became Victoria. His pulse quickened. He reached for the medical records. Technical language filled most pages, but certain words stood out immediately. They referred to gender transition procedures completed decades earlier. Attached identification documents connected those records to the same person shown in the photographs. Richard read everything twice. Then a third time. This isn't possible, he whispered. The room suddenly felt smaller. He searched for obvious signs of forgery, mismatched dates, altered signatures, anything suggesting someone had manufactured an elaborate hoax. Yet the papers appeared authentic, aged naturally, complete with official stamps and fading ink. He grabbed the photographs again. The young face stared back at him. Different. Yet somehow unmistakably connected to Victoria's eyes. Richard closed his own eyes and shook his head. 23 years together could not simply unravel because of anonymous paperwork left on his doorstep. Someone wanted to destroy their marriage. That explanation made far more sense than anything lying across his desk. He gathered the documents into a neat pile before walking upstairs. Victoria emerged from the bedroom wearing comfortable pajamas, drying her hair with a towel. She smiled automatically until she noticed the papers in Richard's hands. The color drained from her face. Victoria, he said quietly, can we talk? She nodded without speaking. Richard laid the documents on the bed. These arrived today. I don't know who sent them, and honestly, I think they're fake. Someone may be trying to hurt us. He searched her expression. Just tell me they're lies. Victoria stared at the photographs. Her breathing became shallow. She reached toward one page but stopped before touching it. Where did you get these? She asked softly. They came in today's envelope. She looked away. Richard stepped closer. Please say something. Silence. I don't care who mailed them, he continued. If there's an explanation, we'll figure it out together. Victoria's lips trembled. I never wanted this, she whispered. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Never wanted what? More silence. Tears welled in her eyes before spilling down her cheeks. I can't, she said. You can't what? I can't explain it like this. His voice remained calm despite the storm rising inside him. Then help me understand another way. Instead, Victoria backed toward the bedroom door. I'm sorry. Victoria, don't leave. I'm so sorry. She hurried downstairs before Richard could stop her. Seconds later the front door slammed. Through the window he watched her drive away into the darkness without looking back. The house fell unnaturally quiet. Richard remained standing beside the scattered documents, struggling to connect the woman he loved with the accusations spread across his bed. Near midnight he sat before his computer. He searched public records, old newspaper archives, and forgotten databases. Each answer uncovered another question. Some names matched. Certain dates aligned with the documents. Tiny fragments of information refused to disappear no matter how desperately he hoped they would. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Richard never went to bed. As dawn approached, exhausted and shaken, he realized the envelope had not answered his questions. It had only opened the first door into a past neither he nor Victoria had ever spoken about, and somewhere beyond that hidden past waited the truth he feared discovering most. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, but it brought Richard no comfort. His untouched coffee had long since turned cold beside the keyboard. Every search result from the sleepless night had produced scattered fragments instead of certainty, leaving him trapped between disbelief and painful curiosity. Victoria still had not returned, nor had she answered any of his calls or messages. Unable to remain inside, Richard decided to follow the few clues hidden within the documents. The first stop was the county records office. Most of the files were decades old, stored on aging microfilm and in sealed archives. A patient clerk located several legal records connected to a name Richard had never heard before. The documents confirmed that someone with that name had legally changed their identity many years earlier. Much of the file remained sealed by court order, but the dates matched those inside the anonymous envelope almost perfectly. Richard left with more questions than answers. Over the following hours, he pieced together scattered information from newspaper archives, public records, and forgotten directories. None of it painted the picture of a criminal or a con artist. Instead, it revealed someone who had disappeared from public view after enduring years of turmoil. Long before becoming Victoria, she had grown up in a household marked by fear rather than affection. Reports hinted at repeated violence inside the home, though official details remained scarce. Neighbors interviewed years earlier had described a quiet child who rarely smiled and often carried bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, even during summer. Richard sat silently in the library, unable to imagine the confident, compassionate woman he knew living through such loneliness. As the years passed, the record showed an abrupt break from that painful past. The old identity vanished completely after adulthood. New legal documents appeared, followed by medical records confirming gender transition procedures completed lawfully and privately. Afterward, there was almost nothing. It was as though Victoria had stepped into an entirely new life. Richard leaned back, closing his eyes. He began remembering little moments from their marriage that had never seemed important before. Victoria's reluctance to discuss childhood memories. Her refusal to attend family reunions. The few faded photographs she kept always began in adulthood. Whenever conversations drifted toward the past, she gently redirected them without appearing suspicious. He had mistaken silence for privacy. Now it felt like survival. Richard's anger slowly tangled with sympathy. If the records reflected even part of the truth, Victoria had escaped unimaginable suffering before they ever met. Yet one question continued haunting him above all others. Why had she never trusted him enough to tell him? That afternoon he stopped outside a quiet neighborhood cafe, hoping to clear his thoughts before returning home. While staring absently through the window, he failed to notice a dark sedan parked across the street. Inside sat a man wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. He watched Richard carefully. When Richard entered the cafe, the man remained inside the vehicle, making a brief phone call before lowering a pair of binoculars from his eyes. His expression remained calm, almost clinical, as though observing someone whose routine had become predictable. He opened it, the man said quietly into the phone. A voice answered from the other end, though its words were too faint to hear. The man nodded once. Yes, he replied. Everything is moving exactly as planned. Several minutes later, Richard exited the cafe carrying another untouched cup of coffee. He drove away without ever noticing the sedan pulling onto the road several car lengths behind him. The distance between them never changed. Back at the house, Richard found only silence waiting inside. Victoria was still gone, her phone still unreachable, and every room felt strangely unfamiliar without her presence. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Richard stood at the living room window, unaware that unseen eyes remained fixed on his home. Whoever had sent the envelope had not simply revealed a secret. They had started something far more dangerous, and Richard was walking deeper into it with every answer he uncovered. Darkness settled over the neighborhood before Richard finally heard tires crunch across the driveway. He had spent hours standing near the living room window, replaying every discovery from the past 2 days while the unanswered questions multiplied inside his mind. When the front door opened, Victoria stepped inside slowly, her eyes swollen from crying and her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Neither of them spoke immediately. She placed her handbag on the table, glanced briefly toward Richard, then lowered her eyes to the floor. I knew this day would come, she whispered. Richard swallowed hard. I didn't. His voice remained calm, though it carried an unfamiliar emptiness. He gestured toward the sofa. Please, just tell me the truth. Victoria sat carefully, twisting her wedding ring between trembling fingers. For several moments she searched for words that refused to come. When we met, she finally began, I had already left my old life behind. Legally, medically, everything had changed years before. I believed that chapter was over. Richard listened without interrupting. I wanted one chance to live without fear, she continued. One chance to be loved for the person I had become instead of being judged for the person I once appeared to be. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I fell in love with you. Richard looked away. You should have trusted me. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? Because I was terrified. Her answer came almost instantly. I had spent years watching people reject me before they even knew me. I convinced myself that if I told you, I'd lose everything. Then we got engaged, and it became harder. After we married, I thought telling you would only destroy the life we'd built. Silence settled between them again. Richard walked slowly toward the fireplace where framed photographs filled the mantel. Vacations. Holidays. Birthdays. 23 years captured in smiling moments that suddenly felt impossible to understand. Were any of these real? He asked quietly. Victoria stood. Every one of them. How can I know that? Because loving you was never the lie. Richard closed his eyes. I don't know what to believe anymore. His voice cracked for the first time. I keep remembering conversations we had. Memories. Dreams we shared. Now every single one feels different. Victoria stepped closer but stopped before reaching him. I never lied about loving you. But you lied about yourself. I hid part of myself. Richard shook his head. You hid your entire past. Neither raised their voice. The quiet hurt far more than shouting ever could. Victoria wiped away another tear. I know I betrayed your trust. I accept that. But everything we built together mattered to me. Every anniversary. Every morning beside you. Every ordinary day. Richard wanted desperately to believe her. Part of him still did. Another part wondered whether love could survive a secret carried for more than 2 decades. The ringing telephone shattered the silence. Both of them froze. Richard answered cautiously. Hello? A distorted voice spoke without greeting. You've learned about Victoria. Richard stiffened. Who is this? You still don't know the worst part. His heart pounded. What are you talking about? The documents only explain who she was. The caller paused. They don't explain what she did. Richard glanced toward Victoria, whose frightened expression suggested she could hear enough to understand. What did she do? Richard demanded. The voice laughed softly. Ask your wife about the missing journalist. The line went dead. Richard slowly lowered the receiver. Victoria's face turned pale. She whispered only 2 words. Oh no. Richard stared at her, realizing the nightmare was far from over, and whatever truth she had finally shared was only the beginning of an even darker story waiting to emerge. Richard barely slept after the anonymous phone call. Every time he closed his eyes, the caller's final words echoed through his thoughts. Ask your wife about the missing journalist. Victoria had refused to explain further. She insisted they should wait until morning, claiming there were details she needed time to gather before telling him everything. By sunrise, she was gone again, leaving only a handwritten note promising she would return before evening. Richard could no longer wait. Determined to uncover the truth himself, he revisited the public records he had searched the night before. This time, he focused on the name of the missing journalist. Buried within decades-old newspaper archives, he found a short article describing the disappearance of investigative reporter Michael Rowan. The story ended abruptly after only a few updates. The case had never been solved. One detail caught Richard's attention. An article mentioned that the family had once hired a private investigator named Daniel Mercer. The name appeared repeatedly over the following years. Richard searched until he located a business address on the edge of the city. The office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building squeezed between a pawn shop and a closed insurance agency. Dust coated the windows, and the faded sign suggested better years had long passed. Inside, shelves overflowed with battered filing boxes. A man in his early 60s looked up from behind an untidy desk. "You must be Richard Hayes," he said calmly. Richard stopped walking. "You were expecting me?" Daniel Mercer smiled faintly. "I've been expecting you since the envelope arrived." Richard felt a chill. "You sent it?" "No." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "But I knew someone eventually would." Richard remained standing. "Who hired you?" Daniel studied him for several seconds before answering. "That depends which investigation you're asking about." Richard frowned. "There was more than one?" Daniel nodded. "I first looked into Victoria over 20 years ago. Later, someone else paid me to investigate her again." Richard's confusion deepened. "Why?" "Because secrets have value." Daniel opened a worn folder and removed several photocopies. "I discovered your wife's past years ago. I never exposed it. That wasn't my business." Richard's shoulders tightened. "Then what was?" Daniel slid another document across the desk. "Money." Richard stared at several bank transfers stretching back almost 2 decades. Small amounts had been sent regularly from an account bearing Victoria's name. "She's been making these payments for years," Daniel said. Richard looked up sharply. "To keep her past hidden?" Daniel shook his head. "No." "Then why?" "That's the interesting part." Daniel folded his hands. "Someone has been blackmailing Victoria." Richard felt a brief wave of relief. "So she's the victim?" "Yes." Daniel paused deliberately. "But not for the reason you think." Richard's heartbeat quickened. "The payments aren't about her transition." Daniel's voice became quieter. "They're connected to Michael Rowan's disappearance." Richard stared silently. "I don't understand." "You will." Daniel stood and walked toward a locked filing cabinet. When Rowan vanished, he had been investigating several people. Victoria crossed paths with him shortly before he disappeared. Ever since then, someone has forced her to remain silent. Richard struggled to process the information. Did she kill him? Daniel looked directly into his eyes. If she had, she wouldn't have spent 20 years paying someone. Richard remained motionless. So who has been taking the money? Daniel hesitated. I've spent years trying to answer that. He opened the cabinet and removed another file. Before he could place it on the desk, his office phone rang. Daniel glanced at the screen. His expression hardened. They found out you came here, he murmured. Who did? Daniel ignored the question and disconnected the call without answering. He looked toward the window, where a dark sedan had just parked across the street. You need to leave, he said urgently. Richard turned to look outside. The driver never stepped out. Instead, the engine remained running. Daniel closed the filing cabinet immediately. You've walked into something much bigger than your marriage, he warned. And whoever has been pulling the strings isn't finished with either of you. Richard left Daniel Mercer's office with more questions than answers. The dark sedan remained parked across the street until he pulled away, then quietly merged into traffic several cars behind him. He watched it through his rearview mirror for several miles before it disappeared at a busy intersection. Even after it vanished, the uneasy feeling remained. By the time he reached home, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. Victoria was waiting in the living room. She stood as soon as the front door opened, studying Richard's exhausted face. Neither of them pretended that normal conversation was still possible. You saw Daniel, she said quietly. Richard stopped in the hallway. How did you know? He called me. Richard's expression hardened. He told me you've been paying someone for nearly 20 years. Victoria closed her eyes. I knew he'd eventually tell you. Richard placed his keys on the table with deliberate care. Then tell me yourself. For several moments she remained silent before taking a slow breath. I never killed Michael Rowan. Richard searched her face for deception but found only fear. I met him once, she continued. He was investigating corruption involving several influential people. I didn't know everything he had uncovered, but he asked me questions because someone had seen us together at a community event. She lowered her head. That meeting ruined my life. Richard listened without interrupting. A few nights later, I witnessed an argument in an abandoned parking lot. Michael was there with another man. They were shouting. I stayed hidden because I recognized the second man from the questions Michael had asked me. Her voice trembled. Then the fight turned violent. Richard's heartbeat quickened. What happened? I saw Michael fall. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. He hit his head against the pavement. She struggled to continue. The other man realized I had seen everything. The room became silent. He knew about my past, she whispered. He told me if I ever spoke to the police, he would expose everything. Back then I had just begun rebuilding my life. I believed no one would listen to me. I thought I'd lose my job, my friends, everyone. Richard remained motionless. So you stayed quiet. I was terrified. And the payments? He demanded money every year. She nodded weakly. He said silence had a price. Richard walked toward the window, trying to make sense of everything. Victoria's story sounded believable, yet every revelation seemed to uncover another hidden layer. You should have trusted me, he said softly. I know. We could have gone to the police. I believed it was too late. Before Richard could answer, his phone vibrated. An unknown number flashed across the screen. He hesitated before answering. No one spoke. Instead, slow breathing echoed through the receiver. Then the line disconnected. Minutes later another message arrived. Stop asking questions. Richard stared at the screen. A second message followed almost immediately. Your house isn't as empty as you think. His pulse surged. He searched every room while Victoria watched anxiously behind him. Nothing appeared disturbed. Doors remained locked. Windows were secure. Yet something felt wrong. In the study, Richard noticed his desk drawer sitting slightly open. He was certain he had closed it that morning. Inside, the anonymous documents had been rearranged. One photograph rested on top of the stack, although he clearly remembered placing it beneath the medical records. Victoria stepped into the room. I didn't touch anything. I know. They searched the entire house again. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing obvious had been moved. Only tiny details felt different. A kitchen chair sat at a slightly different angle. A hallway picture frame leaned just enough to catch Richard's attention. A closet light remained switched on despite both insisting they had turned it off before leaving. Each change seemed insignificant alone. Together, they became terrifying. That night Richard installed temporary security cameras throughout the house while Victoria locked every door twice. Neither slept. Around 3 a.m, one of the motion alerts activated. Richard grabbed his phone and opened the live camera feed. The backyard appeared empty. Then, for only a single second, a shadow crossed the edge of the screen before disappearing into darkness. By the time Richard rushed outside, whoever had been watching their home was already gone, leaving behind only silence and the growing certainty that someone wanted them frightened long before anyone intended to reveal the final truth. The shadow in the backyard vanished before Richard could reach the fence, leaving only damp grass and unanswered questions. Dawn arrived without relief. Neither he nor Victoria had slept, and the strain between them lingered despite their shared fear. Throughout breakfast, Victoria repeatedly checked the clock, her growing uneasiness impossible to ignore. Shortly after sunset that evening, Richard watched from the upstairs window as Victoria quietly left the house. She glanced over her shoulder before driving away without saying a word. Richard hesitated only a moment before grabbing his keys. He kept several car lengths behind her, careful not to attract attention. The streets gradually emptied as she drove beyond the familiar neighborhoods and into an aging industrial district where abandoned factories lined cracked roads. Finally, Victoria turned toward a deserted warehouse surrounded by rusted fencing and broken loading docks. Richard parked out of sight. Keeping low, he moved quietly along the side of the building until voices reached him through a shattered window. Inside stood Victoria. Facing her was Daniel Mercer. Richard immediately activated the recording function on his phone. "I can't keep doing this," Victoria said. Daniel answered, but a passing freight train drowned out most of his words. "Too late, already knows." Richard adjusted his position, struggling to hear. Victoria's voice returned. "You promised. Protect." Another burst of metallic noise echoed through the warehouse. Daniel shook his head. "Never promised, only delayed." Richard frowned. The conversation sounded nothing like the confession he had expected. Instead of discussing murder, they argued about something neither recording nor distance fully revealed. Victoria stepped closer. "I've paid for 20 years. Daniel lowered his voice. "Wasn't enough, they're moving faster now." Richard's heartbeat quickened. "They?" Victoria asked. Daniel nodded. Before Richard could move closer, his foot struck a loose piece of metal. The sharp clang echoed across the warehouse. Both heads turned instantly toward the broken window. Richard ducked behind a concrete pillar, holding his breath. Several tense seconds passed. Finally, he heard Daniel say, "Probably just an animal." Richard remained hidden until the voices faded deeper inside the building. Fear and confusion battled within him. Every sentence he had recorded seemed incomplete, leaving only disconnected fragments that could support almost any interpretation. Unable to risk discovery, he quietly returned to his car. The drive home felt endless. Later that night, Richard replayed the recording repeatedly through headphones. Certain words remained clear. Paid. Protect. Too late. They. Everything else dissolved beneath echoes, machinery, and distorted audio. The conversation answered nothing. Morning brought another shock. Richard switched on the television while making coffee. Breaking news interrupted the regular broadcast. Private investigator Daniel Mercer had been reported missing after failing to appear for multiple appointments. Police confirmed they were searching his office and several locations connected to ongoing investigations. Richard immediately called Daniel's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Victoria claimed she had not heard from him either. By afternoon, police tape surrounded the abandoned warehouse Richard had visited only hours earlier. Officers searched the building carefully while forensic technicians photographed the scene. News reporters soon confirmed investigators had discovered several bloodstains on the warehouse floor. There was no body. Only blood. Richard felt the color drain from his face. That evening, 2 detectives knocked on his front door. "Mr. Hayes?" the older detective asked. "Yes. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding Daniel Mercer." Richard tried to remain calm. "What happened? We understand you visited his office yesterday." Richard hesitated. "Yes." The detective watched him carefully. "Were you also at the Riverside warehouse last night?" Richard's silence lasted 1 second too long. The detectives exchanged a brief glance. "We have surveillance footage placing your vehicle near the building," the younger investigator said evenly. Richard's pulse raced. Before he could explain, he realized with growing horror that every step he had taken to uncover the truth had quietly built a case against him. Somewhere, someone had anticipated his every move. And now Daniel Mercer had vanished without a trace, leaving Richard standing exactly where the real mastermind wanted him. The detectives left after nearly 2 hours of questioning, but the pressure they created remained inside the house long after the front door closed. Richard answered every question truthfully. He admitted visiting Daniel's office and following Victoria to the abandoned warehouse, even surrendering the incomplete audio recording from his phone. Unfortunately, the damaged recording raised more suspicions than it resolved. Fragmented voices and missing sentences sounded like concealed evidence instead of proof of innocence. As the police car disappeared down the street, Richard turned toward Victoria. "No more secrets," he said quietly. "Whatever you're still hiding, tell me now." Victoria stared at the floor. "I wanted to protect you. You've been saying that for days." She nodded slowly. "I know." Rain began tapping against the windows as she led Richard into the living room. She remained standing, unable to meet his eyes. "Daniel Mercer wasn't just investigating me," she began. "Years ago, he discovered my past identity while looking into Michael Rowan's disappearance. At first, he promised confidentiality." Richard listened silently. But then he realized something else. Victoria took a shaky breath. "He learned I'd witnessed the night Michael died." Richard's expression hardened. "You told me someone else blackmailed you." "They did." She closed her eyes. "But eventually Daniel became part of it." Richard frowned. "He found the original blackmailer?" "I don't know if he ever knew who it was. What I do know is that once Daniel realized I was terrified of exposure, he started demanding money himself." "For 20 years? Victoria nodded. "Small payments. Enough that I could manage them without attracting attention. Every time I thought it was over, another demand arrived." Richard felt anger rising. "He took advantage of your fear." "Yes." "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because I believed nobody would separate the truth from my silence. I thought I'd be blamed for Michael's death simply because I never came forward." Thunder rolled across the darkening sky. Richard walked toward the window, struggling to process another painful confession. "Then what happened at the warehouse?" Victoria hesitated. "I asked Daniel to stop." She swallowed hard. "I told him I couldn't keep paying." Her voice trembled. "He became angry. He said everything was collapsing and that someone else had started moving against both of us." Richard slowly turned. "What do you mean?" He refused to explain. The rain intensified outside. Victoria continued. "Then you arrived." Richard remembered the metallic sound he had accidentally made outside the broken window. "I left before anything happened." "I know." She lowered her head. "After you drove away, I confronted Daniel again. He accused me of bringing you into everything." "What happened next?" He grabbed my arm. Richard's heartbeat quickened. I pulled away. Tears filled Victoria's eyes. "Then you came back." Richard searched his memory. "I did." After reaching his car, Richard had realized he had dropped his wallet somewhere near the warehouse. He had quietly returned only minutes later, entering through another doorway. "I heard shouting," he recalled. Victoria nodded. "You tried to separate us." The memory returned in scattered flashes. Daniel had shoved Richard violently. Richard stumbled backward across the wet concrete floor. Daniel advanced again, furious and yelling words Richard barely remembered. Victoria rushed between them. She pushed Daniel away. Daniel lost his footing on rainwater blowing through the broken loading entrance. His heel slipped across the slick concrete. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Then Daniel crashed backward. The back of his head struck the sharp edge of an exposed concrete foundation with a sickening sound. Silence followed. Richard remembered kneeling beside him. Blood spread quickly across the rain-soaked floor. "I checked for a pulse," Richard whispered. "There wasn't one," Victoria replied. Neither of them had planned violence. Neither intended for Daniel to die. Yet panic overwhelmed reason. "We were terrified," Victoria admitted. We believed no one would believe it was an accident. Richard closed his eyes. Instead of calling emergency services immediately, they had carried Daniel's body into a storage room while arguing over what to do next. Every passing minute made the situation worse. By dawn, the body was gone. Richard looked up in disbelief. Gone? Victoria nodded, horror returning to her face. When we came back, someone had already taken him. The rain continued falling outside as Richard realized the nightmare had entered an even darker stage. Daniel Mercer was dead. But whoever had removed his body had transformed an accidental death into a mystery that would soon threaten to destroy them both. The revelation that Daniel's body had vanished left Richard and Victoria trapped in a nightmare with no logical escape. They agreed to tell detectives everything, even if it meant facing prosecution for hiding the accident. Before they could contact the police, however, officers returned with a search warrant. Someone had anonymously reported that Richard possessed evidence connected to Daniel Mercer's disappearance. The house was searched from top to bottom. Detectives collected Richard's clothing from the night at the warehouse, Victoria's financial records, and the anonymous envelope that had begun the entire chain of events. Every item seemed to tighten the case against them. Richard expected handcuffs. Instead, Detective Laura Bennett, the senior investigator, quietly asked them both to remain available while forensic teams completed additional analysis. "We're missing something," she admitted. "This story doesn't fit together." For the first time, Richard felt someone besides himself questioning the obvious conclusions. 2 days later, Detective Bennett returned carrying a thin evidence folder. "We recovered surveillance footage from a warehouse across the street," she said. Richard and Victoria exchanged anxious glances. "The camera doesn't show Daniel's fall," Bennett explained. "But it does show another vehicle arriving less than 15 minutes after both of you left." Richard leaned forward. "A dark sedan?" The detective nodded. "Yes. The same sedan that had followed Richard for days. It remained inside the warehouse for approximately 12 minutes before leaving." Victoria whispered, "Someone took Daniel." Bennett placed several photographs on the table. They also removed every useful trace except the blood. Richard stared silently. "So we were being watched all along." "Apparently." The investigation changed direction almost immediately. Forensic accountants examined Victoria's financial records in greater detail. The payments Daniel had received represented only part of the money leaving her account over 2 decades. Smaller transfers had quietly disappeared through multiple accounts before reaching someone else entirely. Detective Bennett finally identified the recipient. His name was Andrew Rowan. Richard recognized the surname instantly. Michael Rowan's brother. Bennett nodded. Andrew believed Victoria knew exactly what happened to Michael. Years ago, he started demanding money, threatening to expose her past if she refused. Victoria lowered her head. "I thought paying him would keep everything buried." "It didn't," Bennett replied gently. As years passed, Andrew became convinced someone powerful had escaped justice. When the payments stopped after Daniel became involved, he decided to force the truth into the open. Richard looked toward the old envelope resting inside an evidence bag. "He sent it." "Yes." Detective Bennett opened another file. The anonymous package came from Andrew. He gathered old legal records, medical documents, and photographs because he believed exposing Victoria's hidden identity would pressure whoever was responsible for Michael's death into making a mistake. Victoria closed her eyes. "He wanted answers." "He wanted revenge," Bennett corrected. "And revenge rarely follows careful plans." The detective continued explaining how Andrew had secretly monitored both Daniel and Victoria for months. When Daniel died accidentally inside the warehouse, Andrew arrived shortly afterward, recognized an unexpected opportunity, removed the body, and disappeared before anyone else arrived. Instead of solving his brother's disappearance, he had unintentionally created another one. The investigations merged. Michael Rowan's decades-old case could no longer be separated from Daniel Mercer's death. As forensic teams re-examined forgotten evidence from 23 years earlier, overlooked fingerprints and preserved biological samples were compared using modern technology unavailable during the original investigation. Within days, detectives identified another suspect entirely. A retired city official whose name had appeared repeatedly throughout Michael Rowan's unfinished reporting became the focus of renewed inquiries. Witness statements once dismissed suddenly aligned with physical evidence preserved for decades. Victoria had spoken the truth. She had witnessed violence. She had concealed it. But she had never committed the crime. Richard felt relief mixed with grief. Years of silence, fear, and manipulation had destroyed countless lives before the real answers finally emerged. Yet despite the breakthrough, Detective Bennett looked at them both with solemn eyes. "The truth about Michael is finally coming," she said. "But Daniel Mercer is still dead, and your decisions after his fall remain part of this investigation." Richard nodded slowly. Justice was finally approaching. Whether it would save them or condemn them remained uncertain. The months that followed blurred into interviews, legal hearings, and courtroom testimony. Richard and Victoria chose to stop hiding. Guided by their attorneys, they answered every question investigators asked, even when the truth exposed their worst decisions. Each confession lifted part of the burden they had carried, yet every admission also reminded them that honesty had arrived far too late. During formal interrogation, Richard described the confrontation inside the abandoned warehouse exactly as he remembered it. He admitted returning after realizing he had left his wallet behind, trying to separate Victoria and Daniel, and witnessing Daniel lose his footing on the rain-slick concrete. He also confessed that fear had overcome judgment when they delayed contacting emergency services and concealed the scene instead of immediately reporting the accident. Victoria's testimony proved even more painful. She openly acknowledged hiding her past for more than 2 decades, remaining silent after witnessing Michael Rowan's fatal encounter, and making regular payments to blackmailers who exploited both her fear and her secrecy. Through tears, she accepted responsibility for allowing deception to shape every year of her marriage. The prosecution carefully reconstructed both timelines. Modern forensic analysis confirmed that Michael Rowan had died during a violent confrontation involving the retired city official identified through renewed investigation. Evidence established that Victoria had witnessed part of the incident but had neither planned nor participated in the killing. Her silence had protected the guilty without intending to. Daniel Mercer's death followed a different path. Medical experts concluded that the fatal head injury matched an accidental backward fall during a physical struggle. Blood patterns, surveillance footage, and Richard's recording supported the sequence of events, demonstrating that neither Richard nor Victoria had intended to kill Daniel. Even so, the courtroom remained painfully quiet when the verdicts were read. The retired official faced prosecution for Michael Rowan's death after decades of avoiding accountability. Andrew Rowan accepted responsibility for removing Daniel's body and manipulating evidence during his desperate search for answers. Daniel's long pattern of blackmail became undeniable through financial records and recovered files. Richard and Victoria were spared murder convictions. However, the judge ruled that their panic after Daniel's death, concealment of evidence, and years of failing to report crucial information demanded legal consequences. Their sentences reflected those crimes rather than intentional homicide. When the proceedings ended, neither celebration nor relief filled the courtroom. Families left carrying grief instead of victory. Lives had been consumed by fear, revenge, silence, and choices that could never be undone. As Richard looked toward Victoria one final time before officers escorted her away, he understood that the law had finally reached its conclusion. Their hearts, however, would continue serving sentences no courtroom possessed the power to measure. Several months passed before Richard found the strength to return to the house that had once represented everything he believed about love, trust, and permanence. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Children still rode bicycles along the sidewalks, neighbors still waved politely, and evening lights glowed warmly through familiar windows. Only his own home felt abandoned, as though it had quietly accepted that the life inside it would never return. Dust covered the furniture despite regular cleaning by the estate manager. The silence felt heavier than any courtroom sentence. Richard walked slowly from room to room, pausing before photographs that had somehow survived every investigation. Vacations, birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings, and holiday dinners stared back at him from polished frames. He no longer questioned whether the smiles had been genuine. He understood now that love and deception had existed together, neither completely erasing the other. Victoria had begun serving her sentence for concealing evidence after Daniel Mercer's death and for withholding critical information during the original investigation into Michael Rowan's killing. Their final conversation before her transfer had been painfully simple. "I did love you," she had said. Richard believed her. "I know," he had answered. Those words offered forgiveness without repairing the damage. Meanwhile, authorities officially closed Michael Rowan's decades-old case. Modern forensic testing, preserved evidence, and renewed witness statements finally established the retired city official's responsibility for the journalist's death. Andrew Rowan's desperate campaign for answers had uncovered the truth he sought, but only after another life had been lost and countless others had been shattered. Justice had arrived. It simply arrived too late for everyone who needed it most. As sunset filled the empty house with fading golden light, Richard entered the dining room. The anniversary table remained exactly as he had left it on the night everything changed. 2 untouched plates rested beneath a thin layer of dust. The white lilies he had bought for Victoria had long since dried into fragile brown petals. The candles stood melted and cold. Richard gently straightened one chair before running his fingers across the tabletop. 23 anniversaries had been celebrated with laughter, promises, and quiet gratitude. The 24th had never come. He looked once more toward the front door, almost expecting Victoria to walk inside carrying the familiar smile that had greeted him for so many years. Only silence answered. Richard picked up the faded anniversary card still resting beside the empty vase, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his coat pocket before leaving the house forever. Behind him, the untouched table remained where it had always been, preserving the final memory of a marriage remembered not for the happiness that built it, but for the devastating truth that ultimately brought everything crashing down. F.